We are gathered here today to honor the memory of all those books of 2022, for which we had such hope and excitement and anticipation for, that would instead go on to suffer an untimely demise of utter disappointment. Welcome to my top 10 disappointments of 2022. This was going to be a worst and disappointments list. Then I realized all the books were more disappointments than objectively bad. I mean, I think some of these have objectively bad qualities. But on a whole, I feel more compelled about talking about the books that I had reason to suspect I would love. But instead, they stabbed me in the back and they made me not like them. Those sons of bitches. And so those are the ones I'm more passionate about. They were bad books, but a lot of the bad books that I read, the worst books, were books that I didn't expect to like. And I'm getting pretty good at avoiding those. So instead, let's start with the books that were set up to win, and instead they failed. Let's start with Fairy Tale. And I won't lie, I had low expectations for this. And that's sort of why it was such a massive betrayal, but also why it was sort of its last or first, that is to say highest or lowest on this list, number 10. Okay, let's just focus. Fairy Tale is Stephen King's newest work. It is a dark fantasy horror with portal fantasy. It starts so strong. Stephen King is really good about crafting stories that make you care about the characters, and he did that here. He spent the majority of the book setting up our characters, making us care, but I don't think he realized where he wanted to go with them, because once he finally went in the direction of a portal fantasy, it became what I felt like was a caricature. It was an utter disappointment. For what it's worth, it was a self-contained disappointment because I didn't have much excitement going into it. I had a much intriguement, but low expectations. But then I get into it, I get invested, and I find myself all of a sudden realizing this is not good. This is just mediocrity, and I should come to expect that from Stephen King, but still, I'm disappointed. Hence this video. Next up was one that I had high expectations for, not just the book, but the author. And it's an author I plan to return to, but maybe not as quickly as I might have. And that is Annalee Newitt's The Future of the Timeline. This has the making of a really good story. It's basically this world where time travel is real. People are altering time travel, are altering history to erase progress where the world is made. One signature part might be overturning Roe v. Wade, or just pushing back women's rights progress through time. It's not that the book lacked realism. First off, let's be clear. I love a good speculative fiction. I'm all about getting put into a world and then being made to believe, not being made to believe, rather accepting if these things are true, this is how things are going to play out. And that I kind of recognize, I accept all this happening in the scope, in this world that they have set up, the author. I mean, since this book has been written, Roe versus Wade has actually been overturned. So it's not as if you need time travel for that to happen. People are actively trying to make that happen. For me, there was something else about the world that lacked realism. It just felt as if the attempt to structure this world, these characters who are motivated to overturn Roe versus Wade and push back women's rights, I don't want to say they felt like a caricature, but there was something there, that borderline caricature, that made it just lack realism to me. And again, I want to stress, it's not the idea that lacks realism. It's not the time travel that lacks realism. It was just something about the way in which they approached the narrative that just didn't quite feel real. I found it really hard to get immersed in this world as something that would actually happen. And I can't really put my finger on why that is. Maybe it's just the writing style that didn't click with me. Maybe it was the characterizations weren't nuanced enough. I don't quite know. I just remember how excited I was and how disappointed I am. And I'm also just really scared now to pick up Newitt's next books or other books by them. I will eventually. It's just I might be less likely to do so. Now, Whisper Down the Lane. This is a book that I think is closer to an objectively good book. What did I give it a rating? 3 stars. I said in my horror ranking video, if you watched it, that I think Clay McLeod Chapman might be one of the best horror writers I've ever read. He's really good at creating an atmosphere. But for me, this Satanic Panic book that was basically a narrative crafted around this teacher or this kid who was, I say, one of the victims of the Satanic Panic, in that he was one of the people pointing fingers at teachers who were supposedly part of the Satanic Panic, even though it was a lie. And now, as a teacher himself, as an adult, he's biting him in the ass. What we see happening is the exact things he accused other teachers of doing. The problem I have with this book, as I said in my horror ranking video, is that McLeod Chapman sets up the story as a thriller, as a criminal type story, not a supernatural one. And it's not that I'm vehemently opposed to crime-based genre. It's not my favorite thing. I do prefer supernatural, but for me, it's letting us as a reader just know from the get-go that there's nothing supernatural about this. Like, I'm not in the real world. I'm here to read the fiction. Let's reveal slowly the rules of this world. Let's reveal whether or not this actually is a satanic panic, or if there's something satanic actually going on. And to me, not allowing himself to walk that line undercut the effectiveness of the horror. The atmosphere was just dead in the water when I knew from the get-go that all this shit going on was just someone torturing the guy. I was just disappointed. I will say it time and time again, disappointed. And I felt like there was so much hope here. And I may actually pick it up the book. I want to pay close attention to the genres to see whether or not he goes in the direction that I'm more satisfied with. But for me, I feel like the book was sort of a better. It is part of it here, of course, is my own personal preferences. But still, I feel like objectively, the book would have been more exciting if he walked the line. I'm sure there'd be disagreements because not everybody likes paranormal shit, especially since, like, if you don't believe in it, why is it scary? That's a good question. I have no idea why it works for me. It just does. Okay, next up, While Justice Sleeps. Now, I should say, I didn't hate these books, okay? There were worse books than these. But at the same time, I had high hopes for Stacey Abrams' Thriller. And at the end of the day, I think it was just one of the mill. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think she's just as talented as many of the most mainstream authors out there. I was just expecting a political thriller to be more mature in its handling of politics. Like, I expected her as a politician to be better able to craft a world that does not hinge on nonsensical logic, nonsensical rules for the machinations or the machinations of politics and politicians. To me, I felt like she had to make certain sacrifices for the story to work, rather than trying to craft a story around the way the world actually works. And I'm talking about how the Supreme Court works, things like that, and I was expecting her to use her knowledge of the political sphere to make this story just a really well-crafted one, not one that feels compelling, because it does feel compelling. But if you dig a little deeper, it starts to break down, and I would have expected something different from someone who I hold to such high esteem, who I think is a very intelligent and educated person on the very thing we're talking about. And that's why I'm disappointed that she didn't make use of that in the way that I think she could have. Next up is the very first book I read all year. That's called Speak by Louisa Hull. I know I did my Westworld vlog, and I've released it, so if you've seen that, you know my thoughts on this. But let's start with the fact that my first book was not great. That's a disappointment on its own. But then there was just, I had expectations for this because it's just the way it's described as basically an AI reflects on history. We have this AI, modern AI being shut down, and she's reflecting on her life as well as the story of all the lives of several people that preceded her, all the way back to the pilgrimage. The problem I had here was, one, it's not really a story of the AI. The AI is like a loose connection of these different stories, and the stories themselves, like when we see the stories, they have a very loose connection to the AI itself, but it's not really the AI telling a story. It's like journals or something like that we're reading of the other perspective, and their connection to the AI is too loose. There's not much substance there, and we don't actually see the AI's perspective. We don't get to use. The author doesn't take advantage of the AI's intelligence and of the perspective that she presented as she would have added to the story. Like, each story should have been more deliberately integrated to one another and tied to her. And her sort of talking to us about what this story meant, I think, would have given them more weight. It would have given us what the story was selling itself as, which was this giant philosophical reflection on different lives leading to this massive AI. She was just underutilized. And to me, it disappointed me. It set it up, it pretended to be something it wasn't. And I'm just disappointed yet again. Next up was a DNF, but I have a couple DNFs on here, or books I haven't finished yet, because I think they still classify. This one's going to be What Moves the Dead by T. Kingfisher. For this one, I DNF'd it maybe 50% into it. I don't know. I do want to read more T. Kingfisher, but Kingfisher, like Annalee Newitz, is an author I've had such high expectations for. And I came into the story, it just sort of fell flat for me. I found myself not getting invested. I don't have a good reason for that. I was just halfway through it, and I was like, I'm very far into this, and I really don't care or have much idea of what's going on. Was this the one that was compared to Stephen King's horror dark fantasy? It says it's a retelling fiction, so maybe it is. I was disappointed because I had such high expectations for T. Kingfisher, and this one didn't do it. And I don't really know why. I'm going to revisit Kingfisher eventually. It won't be this one. If I fall into love with the works, I'll return to this one, and because it's possible I just read it at a bad time. That can happen. And since I can't really pinpoint what the problem was, that may very well be it. Of course, maybe I'll have a similar problem with the other books. Maybe their writing style, the way they approach a story just doesn't work for me. We'll have to wait and see. I thought this was a sure win when I picked this book up. It's one of those books I pick up that's not on my TBR because I'm in a downer and I need something to excite me. And I thought I was saving this book for that very reason. And I was wrong. So the disappointment on this one, it was pretty big. We're in the top 5 now, I think. And I think it starts to show. Well, then also in the top 5 was a book I've made about 5% in. I still want to hold out hope that I'll like it. So I've yet to DNF it despite not picking it up at 5% for weeks now. But it's Madly Deep: The Diaries of Alan Rickman. And for me, the disappointment was that it's advertised as some massive reflection on his life. And what it is it's quite literally journal entries. And it doesn't read very compellingly. It's hard to even follow along, especially on audio. There was ample material here for a biography, a series of biographies. And that would, and hopefully will, be work worth investing in for the publishers or the writers. This here, it's just, I don't get the impression it was meant to be read at face value. Maybe it was there for him to return to write his own biographies. But this by itself, I tell you, I love Alan Rickman. His death, along with Robin Williams, are two of the most impactful ones that hit me. It was just so sad to see someone such a massive figure in my childhood just gone. And I was just so excited to get to know him better. And this book, I can't stress how disappointed I am at what it isn't and what I wish it was. And I'm genuinely sad to say that. And maybe it's wrong of me to include this on this list at 5%, but I think I'm far enough to know to say that this isn't what it's pretending to be. It's not some magical insight into his life. It's private diary for all to see. And I don't know why they're choosing to sell it this way. I just don't know. Next up, a book I've talked about already this week, or this sets of videos, that is The Night Ocean by Paul Lafarge, a Lovecraftian story, sort of historical fiction, retelling the life of Lovecraft. And for the same reason I've outlined in my tier ranking video this week. Basically, it tells itself as this Lovecraftian narrative, and it starts out as such where it hints at Lovecraftian aspects in the story that might actually exist within this world. But what it really is that the story we get introduced to is merely a mechanism by which the author retells the story of Lovecraft's life. Basically, we have an author we're following who is researching Lovecraft. And researching him, we're slowly getting more and more bits and pieces of his life as he researches other people. And for me, it was that betrayal that this book pretended to be Lovecraftian when it's not Lovecraftian. It is a historical fiction book about Lovecraft. And I remained utterly confused about who the fuck is interested in reimagining some fictionalized story of the mundane life of some racist, bigoted asshole. Like, he contributed shit to horror that I adore. But Jesus Christ, why are we idolizing him? That's what it feels like here. And it's not that the story doesn't push back on his ideas, they do, but it feels a little shallow to me. We have a character who's a love interest, who's pushing back on his ideas, tells him he's basically being stupid, and yet he doesn't stop pursuing him as a love interest. It reeks of privilege. The story doesn't really question that fact. It's just the mere existence of the story, of the desire to have this story, of exploring it. I don't know what the author was trying to achieve. And maybe it was the redefining Lovecraft as queer, a way of reclaiming or mocking him. I don't know. I don't want to get into it here. I can't speak for the author. I just know I was disappointed. On top of the fact that this cover is gorgeous, it alludes to such a delightful, intriguing situation, but that means nothing. It means nothing. Maybe it does mean something, but it'd be very mundane. There's nothing Lovecraftian about the cover, I tell you that. Okay, number 2. My top 10 disappointed. We have Cycles of Time, An Extraordinary New View of the Universe by Roger Penrose. If you're new here, I love science. I love cosmology science. I'm not a cosmologist. I don't do astrophysics, but I love thinking about the origin of the universe, the nature of time and space. And this book was my attempt to explore and investigate the origin of the universe and what came before it a bit more. And that's what this book's supposed to be about. This book was a disappointment because Penrose does a terrible job of explaining what the hell is going on. It feels extremely esoteric, It's heavily bogged down by variable names, or basically quoting things that are effectively variables without the equations in a way that just makes no sense to me as a reader. As someone who's not an expert in the field, I have no way of following, and it's like the spiral of I'm lost. He doesn't do anything to help ground me. Like, I've read some books that will get into the science into a way that's a little bit deep for me. They always end the topic with a philosophical review of the implications of what was just talked about. And that wasn't here. I think that's an important integral part of this type of book, where you need to make sure that you're keeping your reader grounded in the takeaway of the point that you're trying to get across. Not just the big point, but every point that leads to the next point. And that wasn't here. I still have high hopes for his other books. He has other books that I want to read about the nature of science. But this one, as it stands, one of the biggest disappointments of the entire year, hence being my number 2. Okay. This next one, I'm disappointed. It's number 1. But honestly, as I talk about these other ones, I'm not as excited because I've kind of just sort of accepted the reality that The Alchemical Journey's number 2, Seasonal Fears, just isn't going to be what I wanted it to be. It's not Middle Game. And I love Middle Game. I enjoyed Seasonal Fears. But it taints the legacy of the Alchemical Journeys series. And while I will forever pick up more books by this author, and even in this series if there were more, I just don't know whether or not it did more good than bad. And I know what I just said is utterly conflicting. Why would I keep supporting a series that I think does more harm to the original than good? And I think it's just one of those things where I recognize what's healthy, and I recognize also that I lack some self-restraint there. And we're not here to talk about me and my issues, okay? We're here to talk about the fact that Alchemical Journeys was a book that was created because Middle Game was massively successful. And I'm just disappointed that the direction she chose to go. She chose to make this a story that was really just enjoying the world that she had created in this sort of alchemical nature. But she didn't do much to craft a story, a narrative that was very compelling or even very exciting. I pretty much figured out what was going to happen. I didn't expect bad things to happen. I didn't expect people to get hurt. It was just a little too easy, and I needed more risk. I wish and expected, honestly, from this author more for this. I love Shauna McGuire, and you know what? Get your money, do what you have to do. As if I'm talking to her. I know she has other projects, so maybe this was just a money grab. Good for her. Get that money. I'm here for it. Nevertheless, it's a disappointment. I can't help that. I'm disappointed that she didn't want to put more into it. But then again, perhaps it was a fruitless effort. Middle Game remains in my top 1 or 2 books of all time, and perhaps trying to replicate that at all, let alone a matter of a few years, is just not feasible. And maybe she recognized that. And you know what? She has her own process. Shauna McGuire is one of my favorite authors of all time. Will always be. Still, this book, a disappointment. So that's it. Honestly, this video might be my favorite video I've made all vlogmas. I love talking about how much I'm disappointed in a book, because honestly, it's one of the things I'm most passionate about. You want to love a book and talk about why you love it, obviously, but when a book makes you so disappointed, you can't shut up about it. I'm not saying I revel in the negativity. I think it's more that I respect these books for getting me engaged on some level, if not in the book itself. Who doesn't? It's enjoyable. It helps me reflect on what I enjoy, what I like, and what I don't like. It helps me decide what I should pick up next and help me understand myself better as a reader. But this is it. This is my list of my top 10 disappointments of the year. Let me know your thoughts on these. If you've read them, if you think you might read them, who knows? Maybe you disagree with me. But as always, hope you have a great day, and I'll see you all next time on Josh's Bookish Voyage. Goodbye.